The wind howled against the tinted windows of the sleek black car as it climbed the winding mountain road. Alexander Reed sat in the back seat, his posture rigid, his eyes focused on the glowing screen of his tablet. His fingers tapped with mechanical precision, approving deals and firing off orders with the same detachment he used to cut through boardroom rivals. He was the man everyone in the city admired and feared, the billionaire who built his empire brick by brick. But behind his sharp suits and calm tone was a man who trusted no one. He thrived on control, and control was the one thing he would never surrender. Beside him, Lila Hayes sat with her notebook open, pen ready, her face illuminated by the faint light from the dashboard. She wore her professionalism like armor, every line of her tailored coat sharp, her hair neatly pinned back, her voice quiet when she spoke. She was the assistant no one noticed at the glittering corporate events, the one who remembered Alexander's schedules, his coffee preference, his exact travel routes. But beneath that quiet mask was a woman who carried warmth, a spark of humor, and a longing for more than life in the shadow of a man who never looked up from his empire. The first flakes of snow had seemed harmless at the base of the mountain, drifting lazily against the windshield. But now the storm had grown vicious, swallowing the road in white. The driver gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles pale, and even Alexander looked up from his tablet, his jaw tightening. The world beyond the glass had vanished into a blur of snow and wind. "We should turn back," the driver muttered, his voice tense. Alexander's tone was flat, final. "Keep going. We don't turn back." Lila glanced at him, then at the road. The tires slipped for a moment on the icy surface, and her heart lurched. She wanted to argue, but years of working under Alex, Ander had taught her to hold her tongue. Still, something in her stirred. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "There's a small inn about 2 miles down the side road," she said. "If we push further, the highway could close behind us. We'll be stranded in the middle of nowhere. We need to stop." Alexander's head turned slowly, his gray eyes narrowing on her. He was not used to being challenged, least of all by his assistant. "You think I can't handle a storm?" he asked, his voice low, edged with pride. Her gaze didn't waver. "It's not about you handling it. It's about keeping everyone alive." For a moment, silence filled the car. The driver's nervous breaths were the only sound. Then Alexander gave a short nod, clipped and reluctant. "Take the turn," he said. When the car rolled to a stop outside the inn, the storm was shrieking like a living thing. Snow stung their faces as they hurried inside, boots crunching against the drifts. The lobby was packed with stranded travelers, their voices loud, their movements frantic. Families argued at the front desk, couples clung to each other, and the overwhelmed clerk behind the counter was nearly in tears. Alexander's jaw tightened at the chaos. He hated disorder. He stepped forward, his commanding presence cutting through the noise, but before he could speak, Lila brushed past him. Her voice was steady, patient, carrying just enough authority to draw attention without sparking resistance. "Everyone, please," she said, raising her hand. "The storm isn't going to pass tonight. We need to stay calm. The staff is doing their best. If we cooperate, everyone will have a place to rest." The noise dulled, eyes turning toward her. Even the clerk exhaled in relief. Within minutes, the guests began to settle, tension easing. Alexander stood back, watching her with a flicker of something unfamiliar. His assistant, his quiet, invisible shadow, had just taken control of the storm inside as easily as she organized his empire outside. For the first time in years, Alexander felt his certainty slip. He had thought he knew exactly who Lila Hayes was, but as he watched her command the room with calm grace, a single thought pushed against the walls he had built around himself. Perhaps he had underestimated her. The inn had only one room left, and the storm outside had sealed the doors with sheets of snow that looked like walls built by nature itself. Lila stood at the counter, her breath fogging in the cold air of the lobby, her eyes narrowing as she read the reservation slip the clerk handed her. Alexander came up behind her, his presence towering, his voice sharp when he asked what the delay was. She turned, her lips pressed together, and told him quietly but firmly that there was only one room left and they would have to share it. For a man who commanded skyscrapers and boardrooms, this small moment unraveled him. His face tightened, His pride bristled, and yet there was no choice. The snow had made its own rules tonight. The clerk handed over the single brass key, and Lila felt the weight of it like a secret she didn't want to hold. She led the way down the narrow hallway, the air thick with the muffled voices of strangers trapped by the storm. When she opened the door, the space inside was warm and dimly lit by a fireplace, but her stomach twisted when she saw the single bed in the center of the room. Alexander stepped inside, scanning the space with the same critical gaze he used to evaluate a potential acquisition. His jaw clenched, his eyes flicked to the bed, and then to her. She knew what he was thinking but refused to flinch. "I'll sleep on the floor," she said quickly, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Alexander's reply came like a strike of steel. "No, you won't." He dropped his coat across the chair, his movements precise. "You'll take the bed. I'll manage." It sounded like an dare, not a kindness. That was Alexander Reed, always in control, even when generosity was hidden beneath command. But Lila wasn't the timid assistant who nodded and obeyed in silence anymore. She stepped closer, her eyes locking on his with surprising boldness. "This isn't about managing. It's about being human. We can share. We're both adults. Pretending the storm hasn't already pushed us together would be pointless." Her words hung in the air like sparks. For a second, his expression flickered, the ice in his eyes melting into something uncertain, almost curious. He studied her as though he were seeing her for the first time. She didn't retreat, didn't lower her gaze the way others always did when faced with his authority. Instead, she stood tall, claiming space that had never been offered to her before. Outside, the storm roared louder, rattling the window panes and drowning the silence between them. Alexander turned toward the fire, his face half lit by the orange glow. "You surprise me," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard. "Maybe you've never bothered to look," she answered. The fire crackled, and for the first time in years, Alexander Reed was not the man holding all the power in the room. It unsettled him, and yet it also pulled him closer to the flame that was Lila Hayes. He told himself the storm was temporary, that the night would pass and the world would return to order. But deep inside, a different truth whispered. Nothing about this storm or the woman standing before him was ordinary. The night stretched long inside the inn, the walls trembling as the storm outside screamed like a beast that refused to loosen its grip. In the room, the fire flickered shadows across the walls and cast an orange glow over Alexander and Lila. They had tried to rest, but the single bed between them turned every moment into a quiet battlefield. He lay on one side, rigid and awake, while she curled on the other, her back turned, pretending to sleep. Every small shift of the mattress carried the awareness of the other's presence. The silence between them was louder than the wind. Alexander's mind was not on sleep. He was a man who thrived on control, yet tonight, control seemed to have slipped like snow through his fingers. Lila Hayes, the woman who had blended into the edges of his world for years, had spoken to him without fear, had stood in front of him like an equal. That unsettled him more than the storm itself. He turned his head slightly, his eyes studying the curve of her shoulders under the blanket, the way she breathed steadily as if the storm was nothing. Something in her quiet strength drew him like gravity. Then, a sharp crash outside jolted them both upright. Lila's eyes flew open, wide and alert, while Alexander swung his legs over the bed and crossed to the window. The glass rattled under the assault of snow and wind. A branch from a nearby tree had snapped, its weight crashing against the roof. For a moment it seemed like the building itself might not hold. Lila rose to her feet, wrapping her arms around herself. Her voice was steady but low. "If the storm keeps up like this, we might be trapped here for days." He looked back at her, and something in his chest tightened. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't shrinking. She was already thinking ahead, steady in the face of chaos. "You don't scare easily," he said. Her lips curved, almost a smile. "Not when sad. Someone has to keep calm." The words hit him harder than he expected. In his world, people followed his lead, obeyed his commands. But here in this small room, it was she who carried the calm, she who steadied the air around them. He found himself both challenged and drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. As the hours dragged on, the storm refused to relent. The fire began to die, and the room grew colder. Alexander stood, tossing more wood onto the flames, but even the sparks seemed weaker now. Lila pulled her coat tighter around herself, her fingers trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. He noticed. He always noticed weakness, but in her it wasn't weakness, it was honesty. He crossed the room, stopping just a breath away, his voice softer now. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but her teeth chattered faintly. Without asking, he reached for the blanket, pulling it wider. "Fine is not enough," he murmured. "Not tonight." She hesitated, caught between pride and the undeniable chill. Finally, she let him guide her back toward the bed. They lay down again, but this time the distance between them shrank. The storm's roar made it easy to hear the rhythm of her breathing, and when she shivered, he shifted closer, his body heat seeping into her. She stiffened, then slowly relaxed. Their shoulders touched, a spark where skin met fabric. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Lila's heart hammered, and Alexander felt it, sensed it, like the pulse of something dangerous yet irresistible. He told himself it was only the storm, only survival, but deep down he knew it was more. This was a line being crossed, and once crossed, nothing would return to the way it had been. The storm raged through the night, hammering the inn with icy fists, but inside the room the fire had nearly died. The glow was faint, shadows stretching long across the walls, and silence settled heavy over the bed where Alexander and Lila lay side by side. Neither of them slept. Every second was sharp, every breath laced with the awareness that they were closer than they had ever dared to be. Alexander shifted, turning onto his side so he could see her face in the dim light. Her eyes were open, glimmering like dark pools that caught the faint glow of the embers. For years he had dismissed her as efficient, reliable, invisible. Now, staring at her in the flicker of near darkness, he saw something he could not categorize: warmth, defiance, beauty. He felt his chest tighten as if the storm outside had forced its way into him. "You should rest," he murmured, his voice lower than usual, stripped of command. "I can't," she whispered back. "The storm is too loud." Their eyes locked, the silence stretching until the sound of the wind seemed to fade. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, and she hated that he could probably hear it. She sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and walked to the window. Snow pressed thick against the glass, like they were sealed inside a world of white. Her voice trembled not from fear but from honesty. "Do you ever feel trapped, Alexander? Like no matter how much control you have, it's never enough to fight the things you can't change?" The question struck him like a blade. He rose slowly, moving toward her, his tall frame casting a shadow across her smaller one. His voice was rough when he spoke. "Control is all I've ever had. Without it, I'd lose everything." She turned to face him, her breath quickening. "And what if holding on too tight makes you lose more than you know?" He froze. No one spoke to him like this. No one dared. Yet here she was, standing inches from him, her words slicing through the walls he had built. For a moment he wanted to push her away, to remind her she was his assistant and nothing more. But his hand lifted of its own accord, brushing against her hair where a loose strand had fallen. Her breath caught, and his resolve cracked. The distance between them closed. His lips hovered just above hers, the heat of his breath mingling with hers, the storm outside like a drumbeat urging them forward. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt himself slipping beyond reason. He wanted her, not as an assistant, not as someone who worked for him, but as a woman who had broken through the silence of his life. Just as his mouth was about to touch hers, a sudden knock shattered the moment. The door rattled and a man's voice shouted from the hall. "The power's out across the whole inn. Everyone needs to come down to the lobby." Lila stepped back, her chest rising and falling fast, her face flushed. Alexander clenched his jaw, fury at the interruption boiling inside him, but beneath that was fear. Fear of what he had almost done, fear of what it meant. The storm outside was violent, but the storm inside him was far more dangerous. The lobby of the inn buzzed with restless voices as the guests gathered together in the dim glow of lanterns. The power was gone, and only the sound of the storm and the crackle of a few fires filled the silence between words. Lila stood near the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to focus on the people around her. Alexander was close by, his sharp gaze scanning the room as if he could bend the chaos back into order just by standing there. But beneath his calm mask, his mind burned with the memory of what almost happened in their room, the moment when his lips hovered above hers, when he had nearly surrendered control. He hated the weakness in himself, and yet he craved it. He wanted the feeling back, the fire she had sparked that not even the storm could match. Lila felt the weight of his stare, and her heart beat faster. She told herself it had only been the storm, the fear of being trapped, that had drawn them together. But deep down she knew it was more. She remembered the warmth in his touch, the way his voice had softened, almost vulnerable. That frightened her more than the storm, because Alexander Reed was not a man who gave pieces of himself away. The inn staff handed out blankets and hot drinks. Families huddled together, couples leaned close, and Lila felt painfully aware that she and Alexander looked nothing like them. She was his assistant, invisible to his world, and yet tonight, every glance he gave her burned like a secret flame no one else could see. Hours passed. The storm howled harder, shaking the walls, as if testing how much more they could take. A group of guests argued loudly over supplies, and tempers began to rise. The tension in the air was sharp enough to cut. Lila stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, telling them there was enough for everyone if they stayed patient. The room quieted. Even in the dim light, people listened, fed to her, trusted her, and Alexander saw it. It shook him. She had no power, no money, no empire, yet she commanded respect without demanding it. She steadied people with nothing but the calm in her voice. He wondered, not for the first time, how he had overlooked her all these years. When the crowd finally dispersed back to their rooms, Alexander stopped her before she could slip away. His voice was low, rougher than usual. "You're not the woman I thought you were." She froze, searching his face. "And who did you think I was?" "My shadow," he admitted. "Someone who kept the world running for me without ever stepping into it. But tonight, you stood taller than everyone in this room, including me." Her chest tightened at the words, but she shook her head. "Don't say things you don't mean. When the storm ends, you'll go back to your world, and I'll go back to being invisible." Alexander stepped closer, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. "You've never been invisible. Not to me. I just refused to look because if I did, I wouldn't be able to stop." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the storm. For the first time, Lila saw the truth behind his gray eyes. It wasn't just desire. It was fear, longing, a man torn between control and surrender. The storm outside roared louder, as if echoing the storm that raged within both of them. The night dragged on with no mercy. Snow battered the walls of the inn like fists trying to break through, and the wind wailed so fiercely it seemed to seep under the doors. The fires in the lobby had burned low, and people were sent back to their rooms to conserve what little warmth they could find. Alexander and Lila returned to theirs, the silence between them heavier than ever. The room was colder now, their breaths misting in the air. The fire in their hearth had died, and no more wood was left to feed it. Lila pulled the blanket tighter, shivering, her teeth almost chattering, though she tried to hide it. Alexander watched her, his chest tightening with something that was not just concern. He had seen weakness in people all his life, but with her it was different. This was not weakness. This was strength refusing to bend even as the cold clawed at her. "You're freezing," he said finally, his voice sharper than he intended, as if commanding her body to obey him and grow warm. "I'll be fine," she whispered, though her lips trembled. "Fine isn't good enough," he said, moving closer. He took the blanket and wrapped it around both of them, his arms sliding around her shoulders without hesitation. The contact jolted them both, fire in the middle of frost, and for a moment the storm outside was forgotten. She stiffened, caught between pride and need, then slowly leaned into him. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel her heartbeat racing faster than his own. The silence deepened, not empty but charged, alive. The rhythm of the storm became a backdrop to something stronger, something neither of them had wanted to face. His hand lingered on her arm, his thumb brushing against her skin, a touch too intimate to be dismissed. She closed her eyes, whispering, "This isn't right. You're my boss." He tilted his head down, his lips close to her ear. "Tonight, I'm just a man, and you're the only thing keeping me from losing myself to this storm." Her breath caught. She had never heard him speak like this. The man who lived by order and rules now sounded undone, raw, human. The truth of it shook her more than the storm itself. She turned her face up toward him, their eyes locking, and in that instant, the fragile line they had been walking shattered. His mouth touched hers, tentative at first, then deeper, hungrier, as if years of denial broke free in one rush. The kiss was fierce, pulling her into a fire that left her trembling for reasons the cold could no longer claim. She responded, her hands gripping his shirt, pulling him closer, needing the heat, needing him. But as the kiss grew deeper, something darker stirred. He pulled back slightly, his breath ragged, his eyes storm gray and burning. "You don't know what you're doing to me," he said, almost desperate. "If we go further, there's no going back." Her voice was barely a whisper, yet steady. "Then don't stop." The storm thundered outside, but the greater storm was within the walls of that small room. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed surrendered control, and in doing so, he realized he might never want it back. The storm finally began to fade with the first light of morning, the snow outside glittering like glass under the pale sun. Inside the inn, everything felt too quiet, as though the world itself held its breath after the violence of the night. In their room, the air was heavy with the echo of what had happened, the taste of stolen kisses still lingering, the memory of heat in the middle of the freezing dark. Lila lay awake, her eyes on the ceiling, her body aching with confusion and hope. For one night, Alexander Reed had not been her boss. He had been a man who touched her as if she mattered, who whispered words that had broken through her walls. But as she turned her head toward him, she found him already awake, standing by the window, his back straight, his posture rigid. The mask was back. His voice was clipped when he finally spoke. "The storm is ending. We'll be able to leave soon." She sat up, the blanket sliding from her shoulders, her chest tightening at the cold distance in his tone. "That's all you have to say?" He didn't look at her. His hands were folded behind his back, the same stance he used when addressing board members. "What happened last night was the storm. The circumstances. It won't happen again." Her breath caught as if the cold air had punched her lungs. She had known this might happen, had told herself not to expect anything, and yet hearing the words from his mouth still tore at her. "So it meant nothing to you?" she whispered. For the first time he turned, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, longing, but he smothered it quickly. "I can't afford for it to mean anything." The words cut deeper than any storm could. Lila forced herself to stand, her voice steadier than she felt. "No, Alexander. You choose for it to mean nothing. That's the difference." She brushed past him, her shoulders stiff, and left the room. I moved quickly. The roads were cleared, cars began to leave, and soon Alexander and Lila were back in the sleek black car descending the mountain. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken desire, but sharp with the sting of rejection. Back in the city, the world snapped back to order. Alexander walked into his tower of glass and steel, his staff bowing to his presence, the empire once again bending around his will. Lila followed at his side, her face calm, her voice professional, as though the storm had never touched them. But inside, her heart cracked with every step. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the invitation in her hand. It was for her best friend's birthday party, the one she had mentioned to him during the storm. She almost didn't want to go. But then she thought of the walls he had rebuilt around himself, the way he had erased her with a single sentence. If she stayed home, she would disappear into the silence he had left her with. If she went, maybe she would remember she was more than just his assistant. What she didn't know was that the party would not only change the way she saw herself, but also shatter the mask Alexander Reed wore so carefully. Because the one man who could rival him for her heart was waiting there, and his arrival would ignite a storm far more dangerous than snow. The city glittered that night, every street alive with golden light, but the heart of it pulsed inside the ballroom where Lila's best friend's birthday celebration filled the air with music and laughter. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the scent of roses lingered, and elegant gowns swept across polished floors. Lila entered quietly, her dress simple but graceful, her hair loose around her shoulders. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again, not hidden behind schedules and endless lists, not carrying the weight of Alexander's silence. Tonight she belonged to her own life, not his world. But fate was not done with her. She had only taken a few steps into the room when a familiar voice stopped her heart. "Lila Hayes?" She turned, her eyes widening as she saw him. Ethan Carter, her best friend's older brother, freshly returned from abroad. He was taller than she remembered, broader, his smile warm and disarming. He had always been the boy who teased her, protected her when she visited their house in summers. Now he was a man who looked at her with something sharper than nostalgia. Before she could catch her breath, he offered his arm. "It's been too long. Dance with me." She hesitated, then let herself be swept into the crowd, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the music. Ethan's hand at her waist was steady, his gaze filled with easy confidence. He asked about her life, her dreams, and unlike Alexander, he listened with unguarded interest. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if this was what it felt like to be truly seen. But across the room, another pair of eyes burned into her. Alexander Reed had arrived, drawn by business ties to the Carter family. He stood near the entrance, his dark suit sharp, his presence commanding as always. Yet tonight something was different. His gaze locked on Lila, her laughter in Ethan's arms, slicing, through him like a blade. Jealousy struck hard and merciless, a storm inside him fiercer than the one on the mountain. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression and followed her line of sight. His jaw tightened when he saw Alexander. "Your boss," he said flatly, the warmth in his tone cooling. "I've heard of him." Lila's chest tightened. She tried to pull back, but Ethan only held her closer, his voice low. "Don't tell me he's the reason your smile looks like a secret." The music swelled and Alexander moved closer, his presence cutting through the dancers until he stood at the edge of the floor, watching them with unreadable eyes. The tension was thick, like the moment before a lightning strike. Ethan leaned down, whispering so only she could hear. "He may be powerful, but he doesn't deserve you if he can't fight for you." Her heart pounded, torn between the warmth in Ethan's words and the fire in Alexander's stare. She knew something was about to shatter. Alexander was not a man who allowed anything, business, rivals, or desire, to slip from his grasp. And tonight, in this ballroom filled with light, the storm between them was about to explode in front of everyone. The music reached a fevered pitch, the dancers spinning across the floor in a blur of color and light, but all Lila felt was the heat of two men standing on either side of her world. Ethan's hand was firm at her waist, his smile confident, while Alexander's presence cut through the room like a blade. Every head seemed to turn as he stepped closer, the air shifting as if even the chandeliers bowed to the weight of his fury. Alexander stopped at the edge of the dance floor, his voice cold but sharpened with something raw beneath. "May I cut in?" His eyes never left Lila, though the words were aimed at Ethan. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "She's not a contract to be negotiated. If she wants to dance with you, she can say it herself." Gasps rippled through those nearby, the boldness of his defiance shocking in a world where no one ever spoke to Alexander Reed like that. Lila's heart hammered as the two men stared each other down, the music suddenly sounding like the pulse of war drums. She opened her mouth to stop them, but Alexander's voice broke through first, lower now, more dangerous. "You think this is about a dance?" He took a step closer, his eyes burning into Ethan's. "You have no idea what she means to me." Lila froze, the words crashing through her like thunder. She had never imagined Alexander would admit such a thing aloud. Not here, not in front of strangers. For one fleeting heartbeat, she saw the man from the storm, stripped of armor, burning with truth. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, protective, grounding. "Then prove it," he said, his voice steady. "Because from where I stand, you've done nothing but hurt her." The room went silent, the music fading as if the band itself felt the weight of the storm unfolding. Dozens of eyes watched, whispers sparking like fire through the crowd. Alexander's face hardened, but the pain in his eyes betrayed him. He turned to Lila, his voice breaking with more emotion than she had ever heard from him. "He's right. I've been a coward. I wanted control so badly I pretended last night meant nothing, when in truth it's the only thing that's ever meant everything." His hands clenched at his sides as he took a breath, his next words trembling with the force of confession. "I can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to stop. You are not invisible to me, Lila. You never were." Her chest rose and fell, her entire body trembling with the weight of his words. For so long she had wanted to hear them, yet now, with Ethan standing by her side, the moment was sharper, more dangerous. Everyone was watching. If she stepped toward Alexander, she would step into fire. If she stayed with Ethan, she would choose safety, comfort, the warmth of a man who had always cared for her. The suspense pressed in like the walls of the ballroom itself. Her best friend's voice echoed faintly in the distance, calling her name, but Lila couldn't answer. The storm that had begun in the mountains had followed her here, and now it roared not outside but within her heart. One man offered freedom from the shadows. The other offered a chance to burn brighter than she ever had before. She knew she could not delay the choice much longer, because both men were ready to fight for her, and the battle was only just beginning. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath, the chandeliers glittering above as if they too waited for Lila's answer. Alexander's confession still echoed in the air, raw and unguarded, while Ethan stood firm at her side, a steady presence she had always trusted. The crowd circled tighter, whispers rising, the night transforming from celebration into something far more dangerous. Ethan was the first to break the silence. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced even the murmurs around them. "Lila, before you decide, there's something you should know. I wasn't just your best friend's brother who teased you when we were kids. I was the one who pulled strings years ago, the one who made sure you got the position as Alexander's assistant. I watched you work so hard, and I wanted to protect you in any way I could. I thought if you were near someone powerful, no one could hurt you." Gasps rippled through the guests. Lila's lips parted, her breath catching. "You did that? All this time?" Ethan's eyes softened. "I thought it was the right way to keep you safe. But watching you now, I realize keeping you hidden in someone else's shadow was never what you deserved. You deserve someone who will stand in the light with you." The room turned to Alexander. He had gone still, his jaw tightening at the revelation, but his eyes never left Lila. For the first time in his life, he did not look like the man in control. He looked like a man who could lose everything. Slowly, he stepped forward, his voice deep and unsteady, shaking with a truth he had buried too long. "Ethan is right. You deserve more than shadows. And I am not a man who gives easily. I've built my life by keeping everyone out, by never letting anyone close enough to see me bleed. But you—" He stopped, his voice breaking, his eyes searching hers. "You broke through. You stood in front of me in that storm and showed me strength greater than all my power. I can't promise to be perfect, but I can promise you this. If you let me, I will never let you walk alone again." The room was silent. Lila felt tears sting her eyes, her heart pulled in two directions. Ethan's love was steady, selfless, rooted in years of quiet devotion. Alexander's was fire and storm, dangerous but undeniable, a love that had nearly destroyed him just to be spoken aloud. She took a trembling breath, her gaze flicking between them. Then she stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Ethan, you've always been my friend, my protector, and I will never forget what you've done for me. But I can't ignore what my heart already chose in that storm. It was Alexander. Ethan closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, but when he opened them again there was no bitterness, only acceptance. He reached for her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to it. "Then be happy, Lila. That's all I ever wanted for you." He turned, his shoulders squared, and walked away through the crowd, leaving a silence heavy with finality. Alexander's chest heaved, his heart pounding. For once, he didn't speak. He waited. And when Lila stepped closer, slipping her hand into his, the walls around him finally shattered. He pulled her against him, holding her as if the world itself might break her away, and when his lips met hers, it was not the storm driving them, but choice, fierce and undeniable. The guests erupted in whispers, the chandeliers glittered above, and outside the snow began to fall again, not with violence, but softly, gently, blanketing the city in light. The storm that had trapped them had ended, but the one that had bound their hearts together was only beginning. And this time, neither of them wanted to be free.